Welcome to the Leader Post Rider Rumblings podcast, episode number 154 with Taylor Shire and Darrell Davis. And Darrell, we're back again this week. The Saskatchewan Roughriders have managed to win 4 in a row now with a pretty convincing victory over the BC Lions on the weekend. A 39-8 effort in what I said earlier was the most complete effort I've seen from this team all season.
Oh, yeah. Let's hope that our podcast is as good as the Roughriders were. That's as close to perfect as they're going to get. You know, there's some little things that we nitpick about. Of course, that's what our job is, kind of, in some degree. But they turned in a great performance, and they're the hottest team right now in the CFL, and it's a good time to get hot.
One of the things I was thinking of was when was another time they put together a complete effort, and I would say back in week 3 it was against Hamilton at Mosaic Stadium. After beating Hamilton on the road, they came back and put together a pretty convincing effort against the Ticats in week 3 as well. I guess that would be the only other comparable. Every other time this year, it seemed to be the last 3 minutes. It was to be decided whether it was a win or a loss.
That's good for the Riders too, to have some different types of wins, right? You might be able to nitpick a little bit, Taylor. Did they really put their heels on the throats of the BC Lions, right? We talked about a killer instinct. And sort of they did as the game went along. They kept going, but I thought there was a point earlier in the game when they ended up kicking that field goal after the AJ Ouellette fake pass into the end zone, that they were right down there on the 4-yard line. Go for that one, because I think it was 13-8 at the time. If they go for that and get that touchdown, it's 20-8. And the BC Lions, you could tell right from the start, they weren't in the game. They're not. There's something wrong with the BC Lions. Of course there is. It may be something we want to talk about a little bit on today's podcast, but the Lions weren't all there. And I think the Riders really could have shut them down right then. It kept the Lions in for a little bit longer, but for the rest of the game, the Riders really did take control of it. And that is, as you say, a rarity for the Roughriders this year.
Yeah, we will get to the Lions. I do want to start, though, talking more about the Riders, because I feel like even when A.J. Allen took that strange, weird quadruple bounce interception back to the end zone. That was one of the weirdest interceptions I've ever seen.
What's the word for 9 bounces? Right?
Yeah. Oh, that was just sort of it almost caught everybody off guard, and I'm sure it caught the Lions off guard too. They really didn't look the same. They didn't really look like they were in the game after that. I mean, it was only the second play, but I feel like that was just sort of okay, we're here to play, and after that, the Riders just had to sort of manage the game. Obviously, the offense had to play well, and they had to go down and score. And I guess from the first play to the end of the first half, when they scored that touchdown, and then I believe it was C.J. Avery had that other interception, which led to a field goal to end out the half. The Lions really should have just probably knelt the clock and ran out the clock with what there was 16 seconds left, and they were on their own 35-yard line with 16 seconds left to go in the half, and it turned into 3 points for the Riders after the interception. But to me, that was more about momentum than 3 points to end the half, and obviously we knew what happened in the second half when it wasn't much of a game at all.
Yeah, the Lions did some weird things, didn't they? A fake at the wrong time, a short kickoff, which I guess they had to try to start the second half, and that late try in the first half. We always say the teams that are losing, you think, well, may as well try the Hail Mary, and if it doesn't work, it leads to disaster, and that's what happened to the BC Lions, and the Roughriders just capitalized on that. They didn't allow a point in the second half, the Roughriders, and I don't think the BC Lions were even interested in scoring after that because it was well in hand. And the Roughriders did almost nothing wrong on defense. 6 turnovers. You talked about the interceptions, those 2 interceptions, 3 turnovers on downs, fumble recovery, I think. So by Nelson Lacombo, who people have been picking on a little bit for not being in the stats. He's a decent cover guy, but he's not that hard hitter in the backfield. But he played a little bit better, or he played pretty well, and so did the whole defense. So a lot of things went right for the Roughriders, but a lot of things went wrong for the BC Lions. But if they meet again in the playoffs, I can't imagine BC turning itself around to become as strong a team as the Roughriders look to be right now.
Yeah, and I asked Corey Mace that leading up to the week. Whatever happens, win, lose, you want to put together that effort that has you confident if, in fact, they do meet in the playoffs. BC's going to look at that film and they're going to say, oh, man, like, how do we even stem some confidence heading into the West semifinal if it is in Saskatchewan? We'll get to that in a minute too. But the Riders, when you look at that effort, they say, okay, here's the blueprint. Let's go do it again. We have the confidence over the Lions right now. We can go out and beat them in back-to-back games.
Oh, yeah. That was a huge thing for the Rough Riders too, and they're maybe walking towards first place too. I know that that's a bit of a long shot, but if they meet the BC Lions, what do the BC Lions take out of that? Unless they're switching quarterbacks, but listen, let's just talk about the BC Lions and get them out of the way so we can talk about how well the Rough Riders are doing. Ever since Nathan Rourke came back to play for the BC Lions, I thought, and maybe you did too, that they're going to be a good team. Nathan Rourke is one of the best young quarterbacks in this league, and we thought, okay, they'll just push Vernon Adams Jr. aside, and Nathan Rourke will take over, and it's his team. It hasn't worked that way. Rourke hasn't been as good as he used to be when he played for the BC Lions, and the Lions seem to have lost that any edge that they had, and maybe they divided because they're wondering why Vernon Adams Jr. isn't playing. He didn't even get to play in that game. They could have subbed him in somewhere along the line. Rick Campbell, the head coach, could have put in Vernon Adams somewhere along the line to help them win a game, and he didn't. So you have to wonder what's going through the minds of the BC Lions, and I can't see them having any type of performance if they meet in the playoffs.
Yeah, it's clear that this is Nathan Rourke's team, and they have basically said that not only with their language, but also with the money, right? You got to always follow the money, and who are they giving the most money to, and who did they give the money to in the future? It's Nathan Rourke. They're not going to turn on him now and then all of a sudden be stuck with him for the next 2 years. So it's Nathan Rourke's team. But when you look at some of the body language, I think it was Britton Gray right before the game, the Lions posted on their social media account, and Britton, shared this video and said, look at the body language of this. And it was Vernon Adams Jr. leading the pregame rally and Nathan Rourke kind of in the background. And the second string quarterback was sort of the guy to lead all of this. I just found it quite strange, but it says a lot about Vernon Adams that he is not worrying about any quarterback controversy and he even posted on social media, Vernon Adams did, about that there's no quarterback issue in BC, but the fact that it wasn't the starting quarterback sort of leading the troops was kind of just shared a weird message, in my opinion.
It really did, and Vernon Adams Jr. probably realizes being a good teammate can help him because he's going to play somewhere next year. It's probably not with the BC Lions. The Lions have signed, as you say, Nathan Rourke to a long-term contract worth a lot of money. So Vernon Adams good for him. He wants to be perceived as a good player. He is a good player and a good teammate. So somebody will want him. It looks like Calgary may have filled their yearning for a quarterback, bringing in an ex-NFLer. There's always a team that could use a quarterback, especially one who's playing as well as Vernon Adams. So it's interesting, as you note, that the Lions don't seem to be responding to Nathan Rourke. They're probably responding to Vernon Adams Jr., but it's really a mess over there, which is strange because throughout this season, whenever you and I have talked at the start of the year, we're saying, wow, the Montreal Alouettes, what a great team. They're going to walk away with it. Now they're kind of they're good, but they're maybe not the best team in the league. Then for a while, we said it was the BC Lions. Then for a while, we said it was the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Then they lost to the Toronto Argonauts. Now we say the hottest team in the league, Saskatchewan Roughriders. So it's been a strange year that way. And I think it's going to be fun and frenetic looking into the playoffs.
This, to me, is one of the weirdest years I've ever covered in the CFL, based on how it started with Sask and BC looking so good off the top. And I thought BC was going to get better when Nathan Rourke was signed. They got way worse. Vernon Adams Jr. was a big reason for their success early, but then he didn't look good, and then he got hurt after that. Then Rourke came in, and they have sort of just treaded water. They haven't really looked great at all. They've had a few good games, but haven't looked like a dominant team that I thought they would. And then Winnipeg, after their terrible start, have all of a sudden put together a number of good wins, but then have kind of stumbled now. And Sask, I would say this is the weirdest year. Strong start, 7-game winless streak, and now 4 in a row. If you were to look at sort of I like those graphs that kind of project how the standings go. It would be just like up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down for all the West Division teams in terms of where they sit on a weekly basis in the standings and the power rankings and all of that stuff. So just a sort of a bizarre year. And like Trevor Harris, like every other player has said this season, doesn't matter how you play in September, July, whatever, as long as you get hot, get into the playoffs at the right time, whoever is the hottest team heading into the playoffs is going to win it all.
And the Riders are hot on defense particularly, but so is Trevor Harris. He's the hottest quarterback in the CFL right now. Throwing quickly, very accurate. That's why I chided the Rough Riders. Why would you want A.J. Ouellette throwing that pass into the end zone when you've got the most accurate passer in the CFL right at your disposal? So don't take the ball out of his hands. There's no sense in using a trick play if you've got a guy who can construct a real legitimate play. So Harris has been amazing, since he came back and has built himself back up, and he seems strong enough. He's the real leader on this team. You and I were at practice last week. I was a little worried. There was a sprint out at one time, Taylor, that he ran out and pulled up lame a little bit. And he didn't take another snap for the rest of the day. That was the first day of practice. They brought out the trainer and they talked to him as he was kind of stretching, as Trevor Harris was stretching. And I went to the very opening of the next day's practice and he was back at it. So obviously it's just maybe one of those little twinges. But remember, he's on two wonky knees still. He doesn't run very much, nor should he. He's such a great passer, but you always have to be a little bit careful with him. So if the last game going forward doesn't matter, which we'll know, I guess, by the time the start.
By kickoff.
Want to just, I would just rest him, right?
Yeah. They're going to have to dress him, obviously, based on the depth chart. But Shea Patterson could see a lot of time. That'll be an interesting question to ask Corey Mace leading up to that game, because they won't know until, half an hour before kickoff what's on the line against Calgary. But I do want to touch on Harris and sort of how late he stayed in the game. We talked about BC maybe going to Vernon Adams Jr. a little earlier. They just completely went over him and put Chase Bryce, their third string quarterback, in. And around that same time, Trevor Harris took a big hit, was called for roughing the passer, but took a big hit right in the face mask. And then it was obviously an issue with his helmet. Harris didn't look to be injured. He seemed to have an issue with his helmet, couldn't hear the plays. So then he went out, and then Shea Patterson came into the game and finished up. But I always lean towards taking your sort of star quarterback, your starting quarterback out when the game is in hand. And I think the game was already in hand maybe a few minutes before that. So I thought it was a little bit too late. And I think even the helmet issue sort of caused Trevor to come out, and it wasn't necessarily a coaching decision. Yeah,
all the points you made are the reason why they brought him out. Why didn't they just yank him at 36-8 after the third quarter was over, right? They could have. There's no reason why they didn't, except maybe, and we talked about this, a couple of us did, that maybe Corey Mace just isn't used to being in that situation, right? Because we've talked about how they haven't dominated any game, so he's never really had to think about it. He's always kept Trevor Harris in. Trevor Harris doesn't want to come out. He's not going to ever say, "Do you want to take me out for a while, coach?" We know how Trevor Harris reacts to things like that, so he wouldn't want to come out. But that time, the third quarter, it would have saved them that one hit you talked about. And I think it would have been good for Shea Patterson to just get some more playing time, because obviously Trevor Harris is playing at the prime of his performance for this season.
Yeah. Trevor's not going to come to the sideline and say, I'll be willing to sit out if you want to. I mean, if his knee was bugging him or whatever, sure. But that's up to Corey Mace, and it's his decision alone, and maybe Mark Mueller a little bit, but I would say it's Corey's decision to decide when to put in his backup quarterback. And I think they were lucky that it wasn't, he didn't get hurt from that hit or any other hit. And it's going to be an interesting decision to see what they do, depending on how Winnipeg does in that final week, how much Harris plays, how much Patterson plays, or even Jack Cohn. Maybe he gets some reps in there as well.
Yeah. Well, let's explain how it works then. The Winnipeg Blue Bombers, who are right at first place right now, have a 1 point edge right on the Saskatchewan Roughriders. If Winnipeg beats the Montreal Alouettes in the early game on next Saturday, not this Saturday, both teams have a bye this week, but the week after on the 26th, if Winnipeg wins that game in Montreal, the Blue Bombers clinch first place and the Roughriders don't have a chance to get it. However, if Montreal, which has already clinched first place in the East, plays as well as they did yesterday, as we're recording this the day after Thanksgiving, they beat the Ottawa Red Blacks quite handily with Davis Alexander, their backup quarterback. If the Alouettes win that game against Winnipeg, then the Roughriders need to beat the Calgary Stampeders at home in Regina to get first place, which would give them a bye going into the playoffs. They would wait for the winner. In that case, it would be BC at Winnipeg for the West semifinal. So it's an interesting situation, and you're right, we'll be asking Corey Mace about that this next week. They got a week off now, which is kind of a nice time to have a bye, I guess, unless they have a bye, then they play, then they have a bye. Maybe that's too much time off because you want to get rolling. Like if your golf swing's on fire, you want to go back on the course right away, right? So maybe the Roughriders don't need that many byes, but it'll be interesting to see what their philosophy is.
Yeah, obviously they want to host the West Final, I don't think there's any scenario where you would say, "Oh, I want to play in the West semifinal and then go to Winnipeg for the West Final." So, to me, I would say the game against Calgary is going to be a victory. There's no way that Saskatchewan should lose to that game to the Stamps, even if nothing is on the line, even if first place is out of the question. So if they have something to play for, which I think Montreal can beat Winnipeg, even with a few backups, they obviously can't dress a training camp squad with every backup, right? You still only have a certain number of players, so they're still going to have a good team. All their defensive guys, I imagine, will play. If Davis Alexander starts for Fajardo, he's still a really good quarterback. So I see Montreal putting together a really good effort, potentially beating Winnipeg, who I don't think has looked dominant at all. They've looked okay, and they've shown that they can be a good team. So I think there is going to be something on the line for the Riders in that final game of the season, and they better put together a good effort against Calgary with all of that on the line, and just to feel good heading into the playoffs.
Yeah, because the Stamps will have packed their bags. You know,
Yep.
we've seen that happen to teams. Used to see that around Saskatchewan all the time. Their bags were packed just before that last game, and they disappear the minute the game was over. So Calgary's in that situation. Saskatchewan's going to need to play, and the Roughriders are a much better team than the Stampeders. It's going to be interesting. Another team we talk about that's in a bit of turmoil. What's going to happen with the Stampeders in the offseason? We don't know, but they're not a tough team to beat if the Roughriders play even at their normal best.
Yeah. And so, yes, as you mentioned, the Riders on a bye week this week, but they'll be back next week. And one thing we touched on earlier was the return of AJ Ouellette from a hip injury. He missed the last 6 games and looked pretty good in his return. I feel like he was a more patient runner, got to the outside a little bit, but kind of waited for the hole to open and then attack the hole, as opposed to just attack the hole like he was doing at the start of the year. He would take the handoff and run as fast as he could into the back of his offensive line, and even if there wasn't a hole, he would just try to power through. And I feel like on Saturday he was more patient, and he sort of waited for that hole to open, and then he hit it with a burst and put his head down and rumbled forward. Didn't have a 100-yard game, but still looked good.
Close. And you're right. He talked to us earlier this season about learning the blocking schemes with Saskatchewan and how it was different coming to a new team. I think he's been paying a lot of close attention. He watched how Raquel Armstead ran against them, and they're similar backs because they're power backs, right? So he was waiting for the hole a little bit to open up. I think they got a very good performance out of him. Remember, the offensive line has got more of its starters back now too. I realize they're still missing 3 starters in Hardrick, Godber, and Philip Blake. I don't know if Blake and Hardrick are coming back. Godber probably is to play center. That will let although they've got Jacob Brammer playing so well at guard, then they might have to. And do they move Logan Ferland back to guard on the other side? What a good offensive line that would be, and how good is it at the moment? It played a tremendous game. I thought just dominated the BC Lions, and the BC Lions have a pretty good defensive line, but the offensive line for the Roughriders did a great job. Ouellette ran very well. Yes, he did. And watching him get outside was something the Roughriders were probably really happy to see. But watching those guys on the offensive line physically dominate the game, was probably as much joy for the Roughriders as any part of it.
Yeah. So this will be another interesting thing to talk about next week when they do return to practice, because center Peter Godber is expected back from injury. He's been practicing a little bit over the last couple of weeks, so I imagine he will be back, which will move Logan Ferland over to guard. I'm going to say left guard. And then I think Zach Fry will stay at his guard spot, because if I was deciding the roster, I would switch out an American offensive lineman for another American running back to get Ouellette and Armstead on the roster at the same time. That's how I would play it out, right? And then Thomas Bertrand-Hudon, who's still a valuable special teams player, can sort of be third string. I don't think you want to take him out of the lineup, but just to juggle the ratio and to somehow get Armstead and Ouellette onto the roster at the same time, I think you would need to bring in Godber for Brammer, keep Zur and Fry as your backups, but just sort of to juggle the ratio. I think that's the option, because I don't think there's any moves defensively they can do.
No, you're right. The Riders have been running out of Canadians, right? The great stockpile of receivers and offensive linemen that they had have been depleted by injuries. And there's been a lot of talk about Ouellette and Armstead getting together, being on the roster at the same time. Do you see them using a full house backfield?
I guess there's only one ball and you can only hand it off to one guy. So do you need 2? It's not a bad thing to have, but do you need it? And what consequences does that have at other positions, I think is the biggest question. So do you
They
want
did
to
start they did play Clint Ratkovich for most of the season as that other back, right? He was more of a receiver and kind of a spot player. They've taken him off the roster. I didn't see any reason to have him there.
Mm-hmm.
I know he's a pretty good player and they probably wanted to keep him, but having two guys who run a lot the same as Ouellette and Armstead did, I know they're built differently, but they still have that power running game. And to put them both in, I don't know if you can. I don't know if they have an offense designed for that. And usually the running backs get better as they go along, right? I know that Ouellette's been hurt, and so is Armstead. He'll be coming back. So maybe you need him that way just as an insurance policy. But you like to get that timing going with your real tailback. Let him go, and let him get stronger and stronger, which is what the real good tailbacks do. So maybe for insurance purposes, but do you want to use that American spot for an Armstead when you've got Ouellette already on there? And as you said, Bertrand Hudon played exceptionally well when he had to step in for Armstead that one game. So I don't know if it's an interesting concept. I don't know if they're designed to do that, but it's something that I'm sure they're going to consider. I don't know if they're going to deploy it.
We'll have to find out when the Riders return to practice next week ahead of their final regular season game on October 26th against the Stampeders before, of course, the playoffs begin. That'll do it for episode 154 of the Rider Rumblings podcast. Darrell, thanks as always for joining.
You bet, Taylor. Enjoy bye week.
I will.